Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. In this video, we're going to go over the foundations of AWS Identity and Access Management. Now, this upcoming video here is a lesson taken from my AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner course, but I thought it'd be helpful to a lot of viewers on the channel, so let's dive in. Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Identity and Access Management Service of AWS, also known as IAM. There's a lot of concepts we'll be going over here, so it's probably best to represent this sort of visually. So let's dive in. So let's take a look at AWS Identity and Access Management from the perspective of having an AWS account and trying to do something within it. For our simple example, we'll say we just want to store an image into the AWS S3 storage service. Our goal is to save this JPEG image file as an object in S3. But how do we actually interact with the AWS account and its services? I've mentioned before in other lessons that everything you do within the AWS account is done through the Application Programming Interface, or API. Okay, great, but how do we use these AWS APIs? Now, for the scope of this course and the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam, you'll likely be using the AWS console the most. The AWS Management Console is a web-based user interface to access your AWS account information and start using the hundreds of services the AWS Cloud Platform offers. If you're just starting out, the AWS Management Console is a great way to begin learning how to interact with all these services and start getting things configured and deploying those initial workloads into your account. Now, as you progress in your learning journey and need to accomplish more complex and larger scale tasks in the account, you'll likely end up using the AWS command line interface for a lot of your tasks, and also have your applications interact with the AWS API directly and help automate some of these AWS service configurations. So these are the three ways to interact with the AWS APIs. Again, the AWS Management Console, the AWS Command Line Interface, or CLI, and of course, using the AWS APIs directly. So getting back to our example of wanting to store our picture file into the S3 service, how does this actually work? Well, we'll start with the concept of principles. A principal can be an actual person, an assumed role, or a federated user that is authenticated through something like Facebook, for example, or even an application. So basically, a principal is the person or thing that is intending to make a request to AWS to perform some type of action within the AWS account. Now, for our simplified example here, we're just a person looking to upload our picture. So now as this principal here, a person, we need to authenticate ourselves with the AWS IAM service. So what is this IAM service? The AWS IAM service provides the infrastructure necessary to control authentication and authorization for your AWS account. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the IAM service is considered a global service, meaning that it exists in your AWS account and it's not region specific. Your IAM configurations are set up at the account level, and it doesn't matter if you're using services in different regions. So for example, you don't need to set up IAM users in each AWS region individually. All right, so we know now that as a principal, we need to authenticate with AWS in order to send our request to upload that image. So our principal identity has the potential now to use the root user or the IAM entities being a user or a role to authenticate with the AWS account. Now, we already learned about the AWS root user in a previous lesson. Again, just to recap, this root user has full access to the account. There's exceptions to this when we start looking at AWS organizations and using service control policies. But for our scope here, just remember that the root user has full access to everything in the account. And this is why it's very important to make sure we keep that root user properly secured. Now, we know we're not supposed to use the root user for our day-to-day activities within the account. We're supposed to use the IAM users instead. So let's do that. Now, let's say we already created a IAM user called Mike. This Mike IAM user would have potentially a username or password or API access keys or both of those. For example, we'd just be using the AWS Management Console here. So Mike would log in with just the username and password, and that authenticates us with the AWS account through the IAM service. So at this stage, our person principal identity has authenticated with AWS as a IAM user called Mike. And now we're ready to make our image upload request through the management console we're logged into. So at a high level, Mike would just access the S3 service through the management console and basically upload an image into S3. Now, behind the scenes, the management console takes our inputs from that web user interface and generates all those API calls to perform that image upload request. Again, everything in the AWS account is done through the API. The management console just abstracts that away a bit, makes creating these API requests easy for you by providing that visual interface to use instead. But just know that behind the scenes, there's a series of API requests taking place to perform all the actions you're doing through the console. All right, so now that we're authenticated here as the IAM user Mike, should we be allowed to do anything we want within the account? Probably not. To restrict what users can do within the AWS account, IAM uses policies that help us define what actions can be performed and on what resources. These policies can then get associated to an IAM identity like a IAM user, group, or role. An IAM identity is something that our IAM permission policies can get associated with. In contrast, an IAM entity is what we can use to authenticate to AWS IAM with. And note here that groups are not included as a IAM entity. Now, say my job is to upload these images to S3, but now we've hired 100 other people to help do the same activity. It'd be quite tedious to apply all these IAM permission policies to each of these users individually, and then have to maintain them all. So to make something like this a lot easier, IAM has 3 identity types we can use. An IAM user, which we already know about, IAM groups, and IAM roles. An IAM group is ideal when you have multiple users that need to perform the same activities with your AWS account. The IAM permission policy gets applied at the group level. So any individual IAM users that belong to that group inherit those permissions. And while we're at it, let's talk about this role thing. So an IAM role is another type of IAM identity that you can define permissions for through AWS policies. I think of roles as a special type of IAM user. Since they're an IAM identity that you can associate IAM permission policies to and define what that identity is able to do within your account. The key difference with a role, though, is it's not uniquely associated to one person. The role is intended to be assumable by other IAM entities. A role is basically a set of IAM permissions that can be temporarily borrowed by an IAM user. Now, unlike a regular IAM user, roles do not have the usual long-term password or access key permissions associated with them. When you assume the role, the IAM service provides temporary security credentials to your role session. I like to think of assuming a role as you're, just borrowing a hat that gives you superpowers while you're wearing it. Roles are great when you want to provide access to users, applications, or services that don't normally have access to your AWS resources. Like for our example, let's say my Mike IAM user has policy permissions associated with it that just let me upload images to the AWS S3 service. That's all I need for my day-to-day job functions. But occasionally an image may get uploaded in error, and I'll need to delete that object out of S3. My typical permissions would not let me do this. We also don't want to open up Mike's permission policy to allow object deletion long-term. So, we're just looking for a temporary way to elevate Mike's user permissions to perform the necessary delete action of the image. So with a role, assuming I have the permissions to assume or, borrow this role in the first place, my Mike user can assume this role. And this gives me the temporary security credentials associated with it. This will then allow this Mike user to delete the object from S3. The temporary security credentials would eventually expire, and my Mike user is then back to their main IAM user permissions that don't allow for the deletion of objects in S3. Now, roles can also be assumed by a variety of AWS resources to perform functions within the AWS account. Let's say we have an application running on a EC2 compute instance that needs to upload images to S3 as well. This application would need some way to authenticate to the AWS account to get the necessary permissions to perform that upload action. So we know we have the option of username and password credentials. those are intended more for human users. Then we have the API access keys for the programmatic access to AWS APIs, which would be ideal for our applications to use to perform these image uploads. But we want to avoid saving, these types of credentials into the application configuration running on the instance. The idea of hard coding security credentials into your application can be a huge security risk. We won't get into all the specifics here, but we certainly want to avoid having our AWS access keys saved into our application code or on our EC2 server instance configuration files. So how do we provide access to the AWS S3 service to the EC2 compute instance running our application? This is the instance running our application so that it can upload images to S3. We can actually assign an instance profile to the EC2 resource that defines a IAM role the instance can use. So whatever permission policy is associated to that role, the entire EC2 instance and whatever applications would run on it would be able to perform those actions with the AWS account. And this is all accomplished without having to provide any, passwords or access keys to the EC2 instance or application code itself. Now, I'm trying to keep the scope of things here aligned to the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam course focus. So I'm not getting into all the mechanics, the security and design considerations around roles and IAM in general. But, this should give you an understanding of what a role is and a few use cases for them. I'll also be providing some links in the course section following this video for those of you that want to explore these areas a bit more. So recapping here, where we're at in our image upload example, we have our principal identity person that has authenticated with the AWS account using their username and password to access the AWS management console. We also know about users, groups, and roles, and that these three identity types can have IAM permission policies applied to them. So for our example here, we'll say that Mike's IAM user had a permission policy directly associated to it that allows for, just those uploads of images to S3. So this Mike user would now go through the AWS management console, navigate to the S3 service, and upload that image to an S3 bucket. Oh, but Mike uploaded the wrong image here. So Mike actually needs to go and delete this image out of the S3 bucket. But we don't actually have the correct permissions to perform that delete action for our images within that S3 service. So here, if we had a IAM role named, maybe image cleanup that we associate an IAM permission policy to, which allows for the actions needed to delete that image from the S3 service, we could have that IAM user, Mike, assume this role and therefore get the temporary abilities to fix the mistake. So I hope this lesson helps understand the function of the IAM service and some of the terminology around it, as well as kind of understanding the basic authentication flow of principal identities to the AWS account and the general idea of when users, groups, and roles can be used. Our upcoming courses focusing more on the associate and professional level exam scopes will dive much more deeper into the IAM areas, so keep an eye out for those. But also check out for the links following this lesson for more resources to help understand the IAM service. All right, lesson finished. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you found the video helpful or if you have any suggestions on how to improve the videos or what type of content you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.